Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing? Are you impressed? I know you are. It's been quite the day. We have talked about heart disease, diabetes, rare disease, and we couldn't have a really fully comprehensive discussion unless we talked about clinical trials. And clinical trials are so very important to the health of African Americans because it's in a way for us to kind of gain new ground by having therapies that we know will work on us. You know, when you have uh, disparities as they exist, and people are prescribed medications, and you're wondering why aren't they getting well? This is what the doctor prescribed. Well, clinical trials could be that point where we can normalize or at least provide options for patients, and that's really exciting for us. We're going to now talk about clinical trial diversity and health equity. This talk is sponsored by Research Includes Me, a Jansen initiative. For a long time, African Americans have been not participating in clinical trials for a myriad of reasons. But without clinical trial participation, we will continue to experience health disparities and inequity. At Black Health Matters, we believe that representation matters in all aspects of life, especially in science and in medicine. I have the pleasure of introducing you to a rising star, or she's already shining, but someone who really is gifted at helping us understand why clinical trial participation is so very, very important. And let me introduce you to Mel Hardman. She's a certified clinical research professional. Her ability to develop high value relationships with clinicians, doctors, nurses, research scientists is really important to helping African Americans feel comfortable when they are participating in a clinical trial. The vision of her work is increasing diversity in clinical trials through education and awareness, while overall closing the gap between communities of color and their access to clinical trials as a healthcare option. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Melissa Mel Hardman.
Thank you, Roslyn. Hi, everyone. I'm Mel Hardman. As Roslyn mentioned, I'm a clinical science patient recruitment strategist and also founder of Faces of Research. I'm so excited to be able to spend time with you today and share this platform with some very, very smart and knowledgeable panelists. I want to thank Black Health Matters for hosting this virtual summit and allowing us to put our education and our knowledge on this platform so we can openly discuss these very important topics like health equity and clinical trial diversity, which is extremely relevant, as we know right now, around the world due to this COVID pandemic. And I know you guys have heard of all of these COVID trials, and we need you to participate in this, and we need you to participate in that, and just the development of drugs in general, and the amount of health disparities that are in the African American community. Part of the inequity and the disparities are due to the lack of participation of minorities in clinical trials. If you can imagine, our drug development process is lacking because we don't have enough participants in clinical trial of ethnic backgrounds. So I'll spend the next couple of minutes just talking about what is the problem? Why is it here? Why is clinical trial diversity important? And how we can better adopt and adapt a strategy for recruiting in the diversity space. Hopefully, I can get your minds to considering how you can help clinical development by possibly considering clinical trials or thinking about what that means for you as a healthcare option or what it could mean for even a loved one that may be battling a health disease. Over the last 14 years or so, I've been in healthcare leadership. And then about 8 years ago, I moved into developing recruitment strategies in the clinical trial space. And what I've noticed is over the years is how patient centricity, and I know you've heard that word, here in all health equity spaces, clinical trial space, the notion of centricity and how it's become this superior recruitment and retention, the way that we go about gaining our patients. We center our new drug protocols and our steps to development, if you will, around patients rather than the other way around. So basically, since you are the consumer and we're making the drugs for you, then it makes sense for our protocols to be surrounded, more patient centric, more centric around what it is that you need versus what it is that you need from us. So how we write our strategies and we write our protocols, it should be most convenient to you. After all, clinical development is a cycle. We need the patient, that's you, the consumer, in order to run a trial. And then on the tail end, you actually consume the product that you've helped to trial. So it's important that centricity is sort of a stepping stone in how we develop our recruitment. So then, if centricity is so important, the question for me always is, how can we have true centricity and true patient-centered recruitment if we don't have all the possible patients? This is why diversity has become so important. That, and then again, the simple trending topic of our nation, our world today, lacking in health equity in minority and urban communities, among other health disparities and among other just disparities in resources in our community. I want to talk about then what is the problem? So diversity is trending everywhere. We've heard it in all industries, business, healthcare, sales. It's been around for a while. So why is this such an issue in clinical trials? Why is this such a taboo for us to consider diversity in clinical trials? The problem here is there's just not enough minorities participating in clinical trials for the future of drug development to be sustainable. If we consider efficacy and the effectiveness, which is two of the most important qualities of a new drug, this just can't be obtained without diverse populations participating in clinical trials. But of course, centuries of not so ethical clinical trial efforts and lack of equity in healthcare, lack of trust, disparities in the minority community, specifically the Black community, has led to this stigma of distrust toward the healthcare industry and this fear that's in the pharma industry from African Americans. The fact is, normalizing diversity will only be accomplished once we remove that fear that people of color have developed, and rightfully so, toward the healthcare industry and the clinical research industry. The challenge is that we have to remove this stigma, right? And we have to balance the health opportunities and balance the resources for our Black consumers. And that's you, that's me, that's your family, that's my family. I sometimes find myself having to defend my work. Even to my own family and friends. And I stop and I tell them, like, look at me. I may be a clinical developer, I may be a drug maker, if you will, on the other side of healthcare and pharma. But at the end of the day, I'm Black, right? My family is Black. And so I'm a consumer of the drugs that I help to develop. I'm a consumer of the healthcare industry as well. So I want health equity too. I want to increase in diversity as well. It's extremely important to me. It's extremely pertinent to me. It's a passion for me. And what needs to happen is it needs to become just as much personal and passionate for everyone that's in the healthcare industry. That includes healthcare providers, sponsors, CROs. Normalizing diversity will only be accomplished when our patients, that's you, the consumers, feel comfortable about clinical trials, and there is a normalcy in healthcare where we discuss clinical trials with people of color and it doesn't feel weird. It's not odd, it's normal. We, and by we, I mean the pharmaceutical industry, the clinical research industry, the healthcare industry, we have to change that landscape. We have to bridge if you will, the patient to the science. We have to improve diversity in order to improve centricity, so that it is naturally and it effortlessly includes diversity when we're speaking of centricity in clinical trials and health equity. So let's discuss a few facts that are important to understanding just how critical the issue of lack of diversity in clinical trials is, so that we can paint a picture as to why we must move forward in the effort to increase diversity, trial participation, and which in turn creates opportunities for Blacks in healthcare. And we began to balance the pendulum on health equity. As you can see, we're failing as a nation in access to minorities in healthcare access. African Americans remain the least healthy subgroup in the US. And of course, this is deriving from a legacy of social and racial injustice. We know that there's a society that has created these formidable challenges around equal healthcare. We know this. We know health disparities and inequities in African Americans is one of the most negative factors that are affecting the success of our healthcare system. To put it bluntly, if we consider just up against white women versus Black women, we can develop cancer at the same rate. So if you're white or you're Black, you have about the same probability of developing cancer. The issue is Black women die at a 40% higher rate than white women. We can get it at the same rate, but 40% are more likely to pass away from breast cancer than white. Breast cancer is more likely to be found at an earlier stage among white women than Black women. That in itself is a health inequity. That is what has to change. Why are we having such a large gap in determining what stages we are in? Why is it that depending on the color, it will determine when we find out the probability, when we receive a prognosis? The same thing is true for, say, Black men and white men when it comes to prostate cancer. Black men are 2 times more likely to die from prostate cancer than white men. African Americans simply are not effectively represented in clinical research. And this is not only an injustice to the population, but to the advancement of clinical research. The good news is you can help change this. We can all help change this. As I said on the screen, the proof is in the image. If you take a look at the data on the screen, we make up about 40% of the population as of right now, but only participate in clinical trials at a 3% rate. So if you think about Blacks make up less than 5% of the participants in the last 24 of 31 major cancer drugs that were approved in 2015. Yet, the American Cancer Society reports just in 2019 that Blacks are at a 14% higher risk of dying from cancer. So we're at a 14% higher risk dying from cancer, yet we only participate at less than a 5% rate. And really it's less than 3%. How are we gonna have medicines that are effective for everyone if everyone isn't participating in clinical trials? It's just that simple. And that's the question that you as a consumer should be asking yourself. It's also the question that we in the pharmaceutical industry, we in the healthcare industry should also be asking. How is it possible to have effective drugs for everyone if everyone is not participating in clinical trials? So with all of the data that I just gave you, we need to talk about this population shift that's coming. It's called the crossover period. So in 2045, it's said that minorities will no longer be minority. In fact, we will encompass over half of the US population. So if you think about what that means for clinical development, right now we're minority, right? So you're making these drugs and they don't always work for the minority population. It's not a big deal. We're minority. But after 2045, we'll no longer be minority. So if we continue to mass produce drugs and go through this clinical development process without including diversity as a major building block, then we will be producing drugs that will be less than effective for less than half of the population. So as you can see, diversity is not only important, it's necessary for effective drug development for the future of our drugs. It will have a grave effect on the efficiency of medicines for our population if we don't begin to realize how important diversity is. So what is the real deal? I'm working on a doctorate, and my research is centered around diversity in clinical research and why it's so important. And I've partnered with Black Health Matters before, and I've discovered some very true and honest facts and reactions regarding Blacks, African Americans, and our feelings toward clinical trials and research. And what I found was the truth. The truth is, fear is alive. It is a reality in the Black community. There is no way around it. And the pharma industry, sponsors, CROs, healthcare providers, if we want to increase minority participation, which is what we all are trending right now, what we all need to happen, if we want to do that, then we have to work to erase this fear or help to bridge together the patient and science. The fear that African Americans have for the research industry or a distrust, it is real. And with discussions that I've had, the notion all leads back to there is just a fear of the pharma industry, a fear of the healthcare industry. There is genuine and reasonable skepticism of clinical research, and it prevents us as a Black community from participating in research. Not only do we distrust clinical research, we are highly likely to receive very outdated information from our primary care physicians unless we press up on it ourselves. So what that means is unless we are pressing our HCPs to talk to us about clinical trials as a healthcare option, what is the new and improved drug? What are the new devices? What's trending in the industry? We're most likely not going to know what that is. So in order for us to take ownership of our own health, to help us to close the health and equity gap, we have to take ownership and take charge of our own health. I've had a session in the community, an urban community, where I talked about clinical trials. And before I started, I asked them, raise your hand if you're interested in participating in a clinical trial. And I probably could have heard a pin drop. Nobody was interested in clinical trials. It was very few. But after there was an open dialogue where I talked about clinical trials, what it is, what you should look for, what does it mean? When you go to visit your doctor for a trial, what does that mean? What does that look like? And why it's important and how it benefits not just us now, but it's actual a generational give back. So clinical research continues to give, because what you are participating in now will probably not necessarily make a huge difference today, but for your grandchildren, it will. For your children, it will. So it is the gift that just keeps on giving. After I finished talking about clinical research, I asked the same question again. And I asked, now, who will at least consider participating in a clinical trial? And about 20% more people raised their hand than before we started talking about it. So now that we know that there is a fear of the pharma industry, we know that it's not a myth. The healthcare industry knows that diversity is necessary. We know that our consumers, our minority consumers, are afraid. We know there's less than equitable measures. We know that the minority community is sitting on the lower end of the spectrum. So now what? It's time definitely for a paradigm shift. It is time for everybody to do better. The healthcare industry, pharma industry, and even us. We need to take more ownership of our health. And sometimes that means stepping into a space that we've not been into before. That could be clinical trial, that could be an option for our healthcare. As I mentioned before, Centricity is here. It's been realized, it's been mapped out, it's been strategically incorporated into trial recruitment. And now it's time to do the same for diversity. The trials, like I said before, are centered around you. They're considered around the consumer. Without participation from patients, there are no trials. And without trials, there are no new drugs. And without new drugs, our healthcare industry will stay exactly where it is. It will stay stagnant. And as you can see, the industry is buzzing the word diversity, but are we willing to do what's necessary to improve centricity and be totally inclusive and diversive? So I say we can do this. So let's just do this. We do this by moving forward, bridging the gap between clinical research and the minority population. It should be concerned with continued communication and education, the realization that minorities are more inclined to listen to those that look like them, and it's just a fact. It's a testament for how important diversity and inclusion is in the pharmaceutical industry, and how important it is for pharma companies, CROs, healthcare facilities to adopt the notion of including diverse team members, develop plans and business units that are specifically related to diversity-driven efforts for engagement and recruitment of minorities. So now that we've discussed the problem and we know that there's work in front of us and we know that there are things that we need to do, let's briefly discuss how we can help each other. So how you, the consumer, can help, and how us, the research industry, the pharmaceutical industry, we can help each other close this diversity gap and close this inequity gap. What can the public health industry do to help this? What we can do is engage more in the minority population, right? So we can implement free educational seminars. We can provide a better understanding of what clinical trials are. We can do that by providing a very honest, open space for there to be open dialogue. We can hire diverse team members to represent different ethnic groups for a more assorted representation, provide cultural awareness training to healthcare providers and investigative sites. We can create online platforms for the public to research trials and learn more about diseases and clinical trials. What is it then that you can do? You can get empowered. You can take ownership of your health. You can ask healthcare providers about clinical trials in your area. What may be appropriate for you. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov, it's an open website where you can see all of the clinical trials that are happening around the world. You can see, what are the indications? What are the diseases? Is it something that you want to participate in? You can take this information back to your doctor and you can have a conversation with them. You should be allowed to do that as a consumer of healthcare, as a consumer of drugs, taking ownership of that, looking up other healthcare options is what we should be doing and how we can help ourselves. And the most important thing for us to do is to be optimistic. We have to move past the past. We have to stop thinking that there's not something that we as African Americans can do. We are participating in clinical trials. We should be participating in clinical trials. As you can see, the industry has definitely progressed. There are people that look like me that are making drugs. The COVID trials, the COVID vaccines, where people that look like us, like me and you, that are sitting on the boards for those trials. So we can trust them. We can talk to them. We can talk to our doctors about clinical trials. And we need to have a proper outlook, a more positive outlook of what that can do for us. I wanted to highlight a pharmaceutical company, Jansen Pharmaceuticals, that is definitely has the right idea and they're paving the way in the clinical trial diversity space. It is important to note that Janssen didn't just decide to do this year, or they just decided to start talking about diversity. They actually have always sort of had this outlook of we need a more equitable outlook, a more balanced outlook, if you will, when it comes to clinical trials. The efforts have been there. The strategic focus has been there. This company wants to improve diversity in all areas of development. And how are they doing that? So some of the initiatives that they have is they're partnering with churches, faith-based organizations for webinars where you can meet with actual Jansen scientists that are involved in a trial that they're hosting right now called the Ensemble Trial. And you can see the link on the screen. You can go there if you'd like to visit. They also have online platforms that give education about clinical trials and resources, and the content is available in both English and Spanish, and that's at researchincludesme.com. You can see that on the screen as well. The mobile health outreach programs they do, it provides participants with one-on-one clinical trial education sessions with trained health educators in the community. And then they have pharmacist education programs for prospective patient communities. It provides access to multiple platforms, including webinars, brochures, and more. Again, it is researchincludesme.com. Also, it's important to note that Jansen is here and they do have a booth. So if you want to know any more about their efforts, anything about Research Includes Me, have any questions about clinical trials and their initiatives, please go over to their booth and they'll be there for a while. You can ask them any questions and the representatives will be able to help you. I also wanted to spotlight, I'd be remiss if I didn't, Faces of Research. So it is my baby. And I am very new to the space as far as consulting. But what I want to do is engage with CROs and pharma companies and help them to build recruitment that is specific for minorities. This is a passion of mine. The belief that minority participation and ethnic diversity in the clinical trial space will only enhance, not just enhance, but improve the efficacy, the efficiency of drugs, and improve health disparities is, again, a passion of mine. I know that in order for us to move forward, in order for equity to begin to balance, we have to take ownership. We have to look at this thing as if we're all a part of this together. And this is what Faces of Research is about. My vision is to increase the diversity in clinical trials. And through education, awareness, I'm closing the gap between communities of color, my community, and our access to clinical trials as a healthcare option. And the mission is to aid clients, the sponsors, the CROs, the vendors, in clinical trial recruitment strategy and enrollment with a focus on minority populations. So I've gone over a lot of information with you guys. It has been a pleasure being here. Hopefully I will be able to answer any questions that you have. I'll take a minute to go into the question and answer session. If you have any questions following this session, my information is on the screen. You can email me at face.research@gmail.com or call and leave a message at 678-788-3055. I appreciate the time we've spent today, and I'll go into the question and answer at this time. And I'll try to answer as much as I can. I know my time is running a little short. Is getting the word out in the Black church through education the key to more participation in clinical trials for African Americans, or at least a piece of the puzzle? Yes. So part of the strategy for recruitment and diversity is Black churches, HBCUs, fraternities, sororities, anywhere where our people are and people that we trust. That's how we're going to sort of close that gap. And we have to remember that people of color are all about continuous involvement. So we cannot show up for the barbecue and then you don't come back again. So if we invite you in, we need to be able to see you over and over and over again. And it's the same way with healthcare, the same way with clinical trials. If we're going to show up and say, hey, you can trust us, we have to keep going back into the community. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to extend an olive branch into the minority community and begin to get us to trust again. The elephant in the room question. In the light of the distrust Blacks have with the country's treatments of us, how can we ensure Black people that clinical trials are safe? Well, clinical trials have come a long way since the Tuskegee syphilis incident that I'm sure everyone knows about. there are, and you can look these things up. You can go to websites of pharmaceutical companies. You can Google. You can kind of see like where we were to where we are. And what's most important is we're not the only people that are in clinical trials. So clinical trials are for everyone, right? We're just not participating in them. It's not just for whites or Asians, it's for everyone. And if you think about this, and then I'll be running out of time, but if you think about how certain medicines work for one group of people, but not for others, it's because we weren't trialed in that space, right? So the drug may not know what happens in our biochemistry and what it happens in someone else's biochemistry. And clinical trials is a science. So it's not going to be 100% all the time. Even aspirins that you take, the Tylenol that you take, someone had to trial that drug. And it probably gave someone a rash, who knows? But it worked enough that it could be on the market. And it may not necessarily be for everyone, but that's why it's called a trial. And that's why it's called science, right? And so what we're trying to do is to see if it's effective. And your participation in clinical trials helps us to do that. And it also helps to bring drugs to the market to help people like you, people like me, your family members, everyone. We cannot have drugs if we don't have trial participants, because we have to have someone to trial the drug. And there are processes in place for this. There are bills and rights, and there are ethnical codes that we have to live by that we did not necessarily have to live by before. So it has come such a long way. And as I said before, we have to start thinking positively. We have to stop thinking that the industry is out to get us, because that's just not the case. Even with, I've been asked before, are you taking the COVID vaccine? I'm absolutely taking the COVID vaccine. I have family members that have taken it. I am in the industry, so I know the rigorous amount of compliance that these drugs have to go through before they hit the market. And this is not a fluke. This is not some method of, taking the population and limiting. No, COVID is real. And this is our battle against COVID. And so I for one, am going to take the vaccine. And I support the drug industry. I support Blacks participating in minority in research. And this is why I do this. I think I can take one more. Are health disparities that we experience fundamentally due to a lack of clinical trials, or are there many other that account for? Yes. So I think that a lot of it has a lot to do with a lot. So yes, we're not participating in clinical trials. So certain drugs are not effective for us that would be effective for us probably if we had more participation. Another is the way that we view health, and I know this just based on research, based on surveys, focus groups, how we view health is not necessarily the way that other groups view health. So it's very reactive for us versus proactive. And that's on our end. Now, on the healthcare side, there are just disparities because it's always been that way. If you can think about racial injustice, it's the same. It's just in the healthcare industry. If you think about grocery stores, food access, resources, which is why in order for it to get better, we have to do better. We have to demand better, meaning we have to talk to our doctors ourselves. We have to show up for health appointments ourselves. We have to go to the doctor point blank. And we have to demand that we're told the same information that other groups are being told. And that is why Faces of Research is so important to me, because it's going to allow healthcare providers, sponsors who really don't know how to talk to people of color about health. It's a stigma. It's true. It really is true. And so I want to help teach and sort of bring awareness to what kind of lingo should be used, what kind of language do we need to talk about, what kind of resources do we need to provide? Because in honesty, maybe going to a healthcare provider or clinical trial isn't feasible for you because you work 12-hour shifts, or you don't have a car, or you can't afford to get there. We need to find a way to bridge these disparities in order for us to sort of be on the same playing field with everyone else. I think that is the last question I'll be able to take here. But keep them coming. I will try and answer as much as I can after I close out. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your questions and paying attention to this very important discussion of health equity and clinical trial diversity. And I will now hand it back over to Miss Roslyn.
You know what? All I'm going to say is drop the mic. Thank you, Mel. You did an amazing job. We'll catch you next time. Thanks for being here at the
Thanks so much, guys.
summit. Bye-bye.